This is Jacob Goldstein from What's Your Problem? When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
Saks Off Fifth is your secret to fashion's most wanted deals at up to 70% off. On the hunt for designer steals that'll turn heads and leave a trail of envy? Uncover Gucci, Valentino, Versace, Stuart Weitzman, and more, with new arrivals dropping weekly at prices too good to stay confidential. Luxe layers, statement boots, and tailored essentials from Saks Off Fifth will put your wardrobe on the most wanted list. Head to SaksOffFifth.com or a Saks Off Fifth store near you for a style lineup you won't want to miss.
You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Campus Killings,
and
Killer Communications.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
On July 20th, 1990, at 1:25 p.m., a county road worker driving along a rural roadway noticed something in a soybean field abutting the road he was traveling. Getting out of his vehicle, he walked over to the bundle, and I'm sure he was horrified and revolted to find human remains with full maggot infestation. He summoned law enforcement to the location, which was 40 feet north of Lebanon Road and 1/10 of a mile west of Troy O'Fallon Road in Troy, Madison County, Illinois. This is about 20 miles east of the major metropolis of St. Louis, Missouri. Madison County investigators responded to the scene and found the remains of a severely decomposed female. It was July in the Midwest U.S. Bodies do not last long out in the baking heat, and the insects were doing their thing. The woman was estimated to have been dead for anywhere from 3 to 7 days. She had 2 recognizable features: auburn hair tied back in a ponytail and pierced ears that bore no earrings. And she had a silver heart-shaped ring with a turquoise stone on her right ring finger. An autopsy was performed on Madison County Jane Doe. She still had flesh, so the pathologist was able to draw some important conclusions. She was Caucasian. Her age was estimated to be anywhere from 25 to 35, and she was about 5'4" to 5'6", maybe 120 to 130 pounds. Her death resulted from multiple cutting and stab wounds to the neck and torso. She had no defensive wounds, indicating that she was possibly stabbed to death while she was asleep, drugged, restrained, or blindsided by the assault. Her slaying was determined to be a homicide by a coroner's jury considering the case. I've been told that the autopsy report on this Jane Doe contains some ambiguous information that modern investigators aren't certain how to interpret. The original pathologist wrote in his report that Jane Doe's fallopian tubes, uterus, and ovaries were missing. Evidence of surgical removal, a hysterectomy, salpingectomy, and oophorectomy could not be determined. In other words, her reproductive organs were missing, and it was not clear whether this was via a surgery in life or something more sinister, possible removal by Jane Doe's killer. Madison County Jane Doe wore a full upper dental plate. She also had viable fingerprints. These 2 latter characteristics gave investigators hope that she would be easily identified through dental records of missing persons and/or fingerprints on file with law enforcement agencies or employers. That did not work out. No missing persons reports were located that matched to Madison County Jane Doe, and her prints never matched to anyone. Jane Doe was believed to have been killed elsewhere and dumped nude in the soybean field by someone in a vehicle. Blood consistent with her own was located along Lebanon Road, indicating that she was possibly bleeding when removed from a vehicle and dragged into the field. Investigators turned to additional evidence found at the dump site, garments that were suspected to be Jane Doe's clothing. These items were sprawled on a path leading to her body between the road and the corpse. These were a pink Gelmart brand t-shirt with the word Florida and some blue palm trees imprinted on the front, and white woven leather Pebble Beach brand sandals with side buckles, size 7. Because Jane Doe was found nude, investigators concluded that it was likely that she was the victim of a sexual assault. Whoever raped her then killed her and dumped her in a field along with some of her clothing. The Madison County Sheriff's Office has stated that the investigation into Jane Doe's identity involves expending, quote, hundreds if not thousands of man-hours. They searched missing persons reports. They sent teletypes about Jane Doe around the nation. They looked into the ring, the t-shirt, and the shoes, which were mass-produced and impossible to trace. They canvassed the area looking for witnesses, and they hired a forensic artist based in Norman, Oklahoma, to create a forensic facial reconstruction of Jane Doe, so they would have an image of her to share with media, potential relatives, and other agencies. This image was released in September 1990. By then, Jane Doe had already been buried. In August, the county paid for her to be interred in St. Jerome Catholic Cemetery in Troy, with a simple granite headstone that read, "In loving memory, Jane Doe, 1990. After the release of the forensic artist's sketch, police interviewed a man who called in saying he believed he had driven Jane Doe in his cab in early July 1990 in Troy. She told him she was from Decatur, Illinois. She was 31 and her name was Donna. She said she had 2 children whom she had left with her mother in Decatur. She had hitchhiked from Decatur to St. Louis and then on to Troy. But police found no missing persons report from Decatur matching the cab driver's description of the woman in his taxi, and he was believed to have been mistaken. In early 1991, the Missouri Highway Patrol and the FBI investigated whether the murders of 10 women in an 11-month time frame could be the work of a serial killer. All the women were Caucasian, most were strangled, and most were sexually assaulted, according to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The victims were believed to have been killed elsewhere and then dumped, for all but 3 of them in rural areas within a 100-mile radius of St. Louis. 3 of the 10 remained unidentified. One of these was Madison County Jane Doe. A February 1991 article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch stated that all the cases were being analyzed by the FBI for potential links. Unfortunately, no links were found and no identity for Jane Doe either. When Jane Doe was buried, officials in Madison County had the foresight to retain her skull, jawbone, and a rib for evidentiary purposes and future testing. Based on her skull structure, multiple forensic sketches and reconstructions of Jane Doe were released over the years as digital imaging technology evolved. A clay facial reconstruction was released by the Illinois State Police in 2007. The lifelike image showed a woman with an oval face and a very strong chin. The retained body parts were also used in the late 1990s to obtain an STR DNA profile to enter into CODIS's Unidentified Human Remains database. Jane Doe and her DNA profile were also entered into NamUs in March 2016 as case number 14919. There were 4 official rule-outs on her NamUs page as of August 2024, missing women whose DNA had been compared to Jane Doe's unsuccessfully. It turned out that Jane Doe was never reported missing, so these comparisons were futile. Finally, Madison County Sheriff's Office Special Victims Unit Detective Jacob Swoboda took up Jane Doe's case in late 2023 with an eye toward DNA testing and IgG. He noted from the file and the photos that Jane Doe was believed to have owned the Florida t-shirt that was found near her. That indicated to him that she was likely from out of state, and they would need to move beyond traditional methods of identifying Jane Does. They would have to use science. He reviewed the physical evidence in the case and recognized that there was likely still ample DNA available in the items excluded from Jane Doe's burial and retained by the Madison County Coroner's Office. Funding for DNA extraction and the IgG analysis was obtained from NamUs, which in turn is funded by the National Institute of Justice. NamUs's official title is the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Its website, says it's a national clearinghouse that assists the criminal justice community with the investigation and resolution of missing, unidentified, and unclaimed persons cases across the U.S. and its territories. I recently met some NamUs representatives at their booth at CrimeCon, and they were very helpful and informative. I cannot recommend the website highly enough to families searching for missing loved ones. Anyway, in 2024, Detective Swoboda submitted the remains to Othram, and they developed a SNP profile. Othram's in-house genealogy team then commenced the IgG process. When they uploaded Jane Doe's SNP profile to the open-source databases, they found a genetic relative who shared over 1,000 centimorgans of DNA with Jane Doe. This was a woman in California whom the DNA indicated was possibly a niece to Jane Doe. Detective Swoboda visited this woman, the top match, and inquired about her father. The genealogist suspected that the top match's father might be a sibling to Jane Doe and suggested that Detective Swoboda obtain a reference sample from him. But the top match informed the detective that her father, Charles Bernard, had died in Washington state 4 months earlier. She was able to provide the detective with the name of the woman her father Charles had been married to, though. Detective Swoboda contacted her, and she told him Charles was estranged from his family, and she did not know a lot about his relatives. So the detective went back to Othram and said, this guy Charles Bernard, the likely sibling to Jane Doe, is deceased. Othram's genealogist then gave him the name of another potential sibling to Jane Doe, a man in Michigan named Dwayne. Dwayne has been uncooperative, failing to return the investigators' calls. Detective Swoboda even requested the Michigan State Police to visit Dwayne at his home to ask for his participation in trying to identify Jane Doe, and he has repeatedly refused. So, in a stroke of genius, Detective Swoboda Googled the name of the known mother of Dwayne and Charles provided to him by Othram, also suspected to be the mother of Jane Doe. Her name was Ella Jean. She had died in 2021, and no surviving relatives were listed in her obituary. But the obituary did list Ella Jean's assisted living facility where she resided when she passed. It was a super big stretch, but Detective Swoboda called the place in Michigan and started asking questions about Ella Jean and whether she had any relatives that they knew of. Well, she did. The manager at the assisted living facility remembered Ella Jean well and remembered that she had a grandson who visited her regularly and a son from Tennessee who called often. The son's name, she said, was Frank, or maybe Tony. Okay, helpful, but Ella Jean's last name was Jones. How on earth was Detective Swoboda going to locate a Frank or Tony Jones in Tennessee? Well, it turned out that the manager at the assisted living facility recalled specifically that Frank/Tony called often from a prison in Tennessee. Ella Jean had to accept the collect calls in order to speak with her son. So Detective Swoboda had a brilliant idea. He had a list of last names provided to him by Othram's genealogists, names that appeared in the top match's family tree. One of these was Bernard, and one was Michel, spelled Michel. So he started looking at the inmate listings at the Tennessee Department of Corrections website, looking for a Frank or Tony Bernard or a Frank or Tony Michel. And he found one, Frank Anthony Bernard, who had been released recently on parole. Detective Swoboda got on a plane to Tennessee and contacted Frank. Frank was a half-sibling to the deceased Charles Bernard, father to the top match. And Frank said, yes, I have a half-sister who's missing. His mom, Ella Jean, had told him his sister was dead, and she didn't say how she knew that or provide any details. She had just been missing for so long, they all assumed that she was no longer living. Frank was able to provide a photo of his sister, who looked very much like the clay reconstruction image prepared in 2007. Her name was Wynona Nadine Michel, and she went by Wendy. He confirmed that she had reddish hair and wore an upper dental plate. A buccal swab from Frank confirmed the identification. At a recent press conference, Madison County Sheriff Jeff Connor announced that through investigative genetic genealogy, his agency had identified Jane Doe as Wynona Nadine Michel, who went by Wendy. Wendy was a full sibling to Charles Bernard, making her an aunt to the top match, consistent with the over 1,000 centimorgans of shared DNA. She was half-sibling to Dwayne and to Frank Bernard. Wendy was born on August 23, 1959 in Los Angeles. Her mother was Ella Jean Jones. Her father's name is unknown. Apparently, Wendy had 4 siblings, and of the 5 kids born to her mother, only 2 shared a father. Wendy lived in central Tennessee from ages 2 to 16, And then, at around the time of Wendy's 16th birthday in 1975, the family moved to Vero Beach, Florida. Remember the Florida t-shirt found near Jane Doe. I found an application for a marriage license for Wynona Nadine Michel in Vero Beach in 1977 with a man named Charles McCallum, but I don't know if that wedding ever happened. According to family, Wendy lived in Vero Beach for about 8 years. Wendy next turned up in the area of Anderson and Shasta, California, where she was living in 1983. On May 21st of 1983, she married Keith Vernon Black at the Lakeside Wedding Chapel in Zephyr Cove, Nevada. I'm uncertain what happened with this marriage. Keith Black is deceased. His son remembers Wendy but didn't know her well at all. The next public document I found for her was a marriage license granted in December 1987 to Wynona Nadine Michel of Redding, California, age 28, and George Arnold Branscombe Jr., age 39, also of Redding. Again, it's unclear whether the two actually married. Modern investigators have been unable to confirm whether a union took place. But we do know that Wendy had 2 children, a girl and a boy, from different fathers. Her son was born not too long before Wendy vanished. Okay, so what happened to Wendy? How did she end up deceased and nameless in Madison County, Illinois in 1990? Detective Swoboda was able to put together a timeline of Wendy's last few months based on information from her brother Frank and from Judy, the ex-wife of Wendy's brother Dwayne, the one who won't speak with the police. Luckily, his former wife Judy was willing to cooperate and bent over backwards to help reconstruct Wendy's timeline. Wendy and her 2 children took a bus to Nashville, Tennessee on April 19, 1990. They visited with Wendy's family there, her mother Ella Jean, her brother Frank, and her brother Dwayne and his then-wife Judy. They were there all of Easter weekend. Dwayne was in the military and was stationed in the Washington, D.C. area, but the group converged in Nashville for the holiday. During this visit, the last known photo of Wendy was taken. She's on a couch with her 2 children, her daughter, who looks about 6 or 7, and her son, perhaps 18 months. They're all smiling and looking happy. It's unclear what happened next, but Wendy left the kids in the care of Dwayne and his wife, Judy. The couple took their niece and nephew back to D.C. with them, and Wendy hit the road. I don't know what reason Wendy gave for leaving the kids. Her family told Detective Swoboda basically that she became itinerant, traveling around hitching rides with truckers. In May of 1990, Wendy came to D.C. for a prearranged meetup with her kids. Dwayne and Judy agreed to meet her at a local mall. They didn't want her to come to their home because apparently they disapproved somewhat of her lifestyle. Wendy visited with the kids for a bit. During this short visit, Wendy had a man with her whom her brother's former wife recalls was a trucker. She doesn't recall anything else about him, though, even what he looked like. At the end of the visit, Wendy left with this trucker and was never seen or heard from again. She turned up dead in the soybean field in Illinois in July of 1990. She had no connection to the area or to nearby St. Louis. She was 30 years old. Wendy's daughter died of a drug overdose in 2017, but her son Josh is still alive and living in California. He is reportedly homeless and has not spoken with investigators. Josh is the grandson of Ella Jean Jones, whom the Michigan Assisted Living Facility manager recalled visiting his grandmother there, the son of Ella Jean's daughter, Wendy. Wendy's half-brother Frank Bernard has spoken publicly about his sister. He told First Alert for, quote, "My sister traveled a lot and sometimes you didn't know where she was at. It was pretty devastating hearing she was brutally murdered like that." 5 on Your Side also covered the identification of Wendy, saying that her brother Frank described his sister as loving with a good heart, fun, and an animal lover. The last time he saw her was the year she died. Quote, "She dropped off her children with my brother. We didn't think she'd come to any harm. My sister traveled a lot and sometimes you didn't know where she was at for months at a time. You didn't know. Over the years, it got suspicious because it took so long to hear from her or hear about her." End quote. Unfortunately, the family never reported Wendy missing. Frank told Detective Swoboda he remembered that ring that Wendy wore, the heart-shaped one found on Jane Doe. All right, so again, what happened to Wendy? How did she end up stabbed to death and naked in a field in Madison County, Illinois? Well, you heard it. Her family says she was hitchhiking around with truckers. As I discussed with Detective Swoboda, there were a lot of serial killer truckers prowling the U.S. at the time, particularly along major highways in the Midwest. For this reason, there is no shortage of suspects, men like John Fortenberry, Sean Patrick Goebel, Bruce Mendenhall, and Keith Hunter Jesperson, who sometimes didn't even know the names of the women they victimized and killed. Another possibility is Larry Dwayne Hall, who also traveled the country and left a long string of victims in his wake, including in Illinois. No doubt Wendy, a fun-loving, free spirit who was clearly in search of something elusive in her life, was picked up at a truck stop or gas station and driven to her fate. It's worth noting, though, that whatever trucker Wendy was with during that May 1990 visit with her kids, he was a big enough part of her life that he joined her on this visit. One wonders whether he was the same man who killed her or whether she had moved on. Wendy's underwear, pants, and purse were never found. Were they trophies for some deranged killer, or were they simply discarded as carelessly as Wendy herself was? We will probably never know. While it's discouraging that the prime suspect in Wendy's murder is an entire category of professionals, men in the long-haul trucking industry, I'd like to think there is hope that Wendy's case will be solved. Detective Swoboda, who works in digital forensics, cybercrime, and sex crimes, takes up cold cases in his spare time. And while he's not a scientist, inside joke, he is determined to use verified, proven investigative methods and science to advance the case. He has been working with the FBI's VICAP program to research truckers listed in their Highway Serial Killings Initiative database. He told me he has several men on the radar based on trucking routes and dates. He's also hoping that advanced DNA testing on Wendy's clothing will eventually yield viable results, and they will get a hit to one of these guys who is already in CODIS. One thing I need to circle back to, the possibility that Wendy was sexually mutilated by her killer versus having her reproductive organs removed in life versus them being missing due to predation. The original pathology report is unclear, so we are left to speculate. Detective Swoboda and I discussed this at length and decided that it was unlikely that Wendy had surgery to remove her reproductive organs. She was just 30 years old. That would have catapulted her into menopause. Further, she had her son fairly recently. It seems unlikely all these organs would be removed so soon on the heels of giving birth. Of course, if Wendy's killer indeed mutilated her body in order to remove her reproductive system, it adds a whole new level of horror to this case. And it also calls to mind another case, one so close in proximity to Wendy's that it can't be ignored. A woman known as Summerfield Jane Doe was found murdered on September 6, 1986, 4 years before Wendy. Her body was found by a farmer in a Lebanon cornfield in neighboring St. Clair County, 15 miles from Wendy's dump site. She'd been strangled with a piece of her own clothing, unlike Wendy, but she was nude, she had no defensive wounds, and her pelvis was cut open and her reproductive organs attempted to be removed by her killer. Summerfield Jane Doe was identified in the 2000s by fingerprints. She was 27-year-old Eulalia Chavez. Like Wendy, she was also born in 1959. She grew up in California, but was known to hitchhike across the country to attend concerts. Of course, I asked Detective Swoboda whether these two cases, Wendy's and Leah's, are related. What are the chances they aren't, given the similarities? Detective Swoboda acknowledges that they are too close together geographically to ignore a possible link, and that the parallels are undeniable. He has been working with the detective assigned to Leah's case, and they exchange information. He tells me that after extensively reviewing both case files, he doubts that the cases are related, but he's not ruling the possibility out either. So in the end, while we now know who Madison County 1990 Jane Doe is, Wendy Michel, there is an awful lot we don't know. At the press conference announcing the identification, Madison County Sheriff Jeff Connor said, quote, "We wanted to bring some closure to Wynona's family, but we also request that anyone reach out to the Madison County Sheriff's Office to assist with finding the killer. We urge you to review the attached photographs of Wynona and her family and contact our office with any information. Anyone with information is encouraged to contact the Madison County Sheriff's Office at 618-692-4433, the anonymous tip line at 618-296-3000, or Crime Stoppers at 866-371-TIPS. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. Before you leave, please let me tell you about some important things related to the show. If you'd like to support this podcast, and in the process, get access to early and ad-free episodes, as well as bonus content like crime scene photos, you can sign up for a Patreon subscription for only $5 a month by heading over to patreon.com/DNAID. Of course, you're welcome to contribute more than $5 a month. We rely on Patreon funds to pay for the original source materials I use to research each episode. If Patreon isn't your thing, you can also show your support with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. It costs just $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year. Your AbJack Insider subscription will give you the same benefits for not only DNA ID, but for all of the shows on the AbJack network, like Killer Communications and Campus Killings. Head over to Apple Podcasts and find the DNA ID page or look for the AbJack network to get started. If you're on social media, we'd love to interact with you there. DNA ID is on every major social media platform. Search your favorite platforms for DNA ID Podcast to find us. We also have a YouTube channel, and our website is dnaidpodcast.com. You can find links to all of these anytime in our show notes. If you need to reach the show, contact us by emailing dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Finally, if you want to pick up some fun DNA ID merch and represent the show, visit the store at www.customizedgirl.com/s/DNA ID podcast. DNA ID is researched, written, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt.